So, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's book talk for the New Internationals. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able, you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Today, we are honored to be joined by David Wright Folliday and Donald Weber. David Wright Folliday is a professor of English at the University of Illinois and the author of the novel Black Cloud Rising, a New York Times critic's pick and one of the New Yorker's best books of 2022. He's also the co-author of the young adult novel Away Running and the nonfiction book Fire on the Beach, recovering the lost story of Richard Etheridge and the Pea Island Lifesavers, which was a New Yorker notable selection and a St. Louis Dispatch Best Book of 2001. The recipient of a Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Award, he has written for The New Yorker, The Village Voice, The Southern Review, Newsday, and more. Donald Weber is a literary scholar and cultural critic, specializing in Jewish American literature and popular culture. He is the author of Haunted in the New World, Jewish American Culture, from Kahan to the Goldbergs. His reviews have appeared in The Forward, The Chronicle Review, The Chicago Tribune, and the Jewish Book Council, among others. His most recent essay is Sid Caesar's Comedy of Excess and the Jewish American 1950s in the journal Jewish Film and New Media. He divides his time between Brooklyn and Mohegan Lake, New York. You can purchase the New Internationals at the link in the chat, which I highly encourage you all to do. Thank you again for joining us tonight. I'm now going to hand things over to David and Donald.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here tonight to talk with David about his brilliant novel, and I thought I'd begin with a large question about what David speaks about in an essay in the New Yorker called "The Truth About My Father," which is more or less the sort of origins. Biographical or autobiographical origins to the New Internationals. He speaks about being an insider and outsider as his position, as his place in the world, how he understands things, and about one of the main characters in the New Internationals who we encounter. One of the main ones, his name is Zeb. He's a man, we're told, quote, caught between two names. So this notion of being an insider, outsider, or being divided seems really key both to the novel itself and perhaps to your own understanding of yourself as an artist. So I'm wondering, as a way to begin, you might speak about how the New Internationals came to be. For those who haven't read the novel, what it's about, at least to give people a sense of what you're up to in this epic book. The Wall Street Journal calls it that it chronicles a cultural turning point. So we're in sort of world history as well as the emotional and psychological history of all these rich characters who form deep parts of your own autobiographical story. So what is it like to be an insider, outsider, to be caught between two names? And how does that all connect to how you came to write the New Internationals?
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, Donald. And thanks everybody for joining us this evening. So I grew up My mother was a Holocaust survivor. I grew up knowing that. My mother was a French Jew. She raised my older sister, 17 months older than me, and she raised us for big chunks of time, not always, but for big chunks of time on her own. And so we were like this little unit. I was born in 1964 in France, but we came to the United States in 66. So before Loving v. Virginia, none of that means anything to me, but clearly it meant something to my mother. And so my mother was really concerned about, as this white woman with these two biracial children in the 1960s, and fairly quickly divorced from Bayless Wright, Jack Wright, who at that point I thought was my biological father. We were always just sort of other in a weird, other beyond sort of the otherness of blackness. You know, I remember as kids, when we would see a mixed race couple, it was so rare, we would, point them out, and it would be this sort of admiration, like there's more people like us. We just felt really different. As I grew older, and you start making choices, or choices start being made for you, maybe, or you start getting forced into choices. Like my clear identification was as a Black person, and my mom really encouraged it. She always wore a Star of David, but she didn't really, like, we didn't do anything specifically Jewish. So I understand that this is the world that's part of my world, but I don't know what it means. Being a young Black man, on the other hand, that was made very plain to me at fairly young age. So I'm growing up fundamentally knowing how to code switch, I think, sort of being in different communities at different times and learning without realizing this is what I'm learning, how to code switch. So that's the insider outsider part. As I don't want to belabor my own personal history to the degree to which it might take us off track, but as I get older and I start to understand my history, I understand myself as the child of an African-American man from Kansas City, from a fairly, historically a poor family. Like he had grown up in poverty. We were fairly poor at times when I was a kid, and they'd separate, they divorce. And, this white mother, I'm in those in-between spaces. And as I then learned that I had this African heritage, to me, it just seemed like I was the intersection of a lot of different worlds. And that struck me as interesting. And the more I got older, again, not the me part of it, but the them part of it. How does this woman who's a Holocaust survivor, end up married to a Black GI, but also has this interesting, important connection to French anti-colonial Africans and the African movement. And that's what drew me to the story. So at heart, the other part of your question, as I was uncovering and learning this story, it just, from the very beginning, when I first decided I think I want to try to be a writer, and there's just, I want to try to tell stories about Americanness fundamentally. I am American. But if in me all this sort of conflicted stuff, I thought, what better way to tell it than through that story, this love triangle between a Holocaust survivor, a Black GI, and an African from the colonies. And it should be, I should note that the particular colony and this particular African, and this holds true with my own biological father, he's from what was Dahomey, that in the era of the transatlantic slave trade was that part of West Africa that was called the Slave Coast, the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, and there was the Slave Coast. And the dominant African kingdom in that part of Africa that was super involved, very complicit in the selling of slaves, the kings of Dahomey. Mm-hmm. My father is the grandson of the last king of Dahomey. So it's a descendant of slaves, a Holocaust survivor, and a descendant of African slave traders. And that's the love triangle at the heart of the story. And it's set in Paris in 1947, in that moment after the war, when those worlds come together in a really interesting way. Having survived the Holocaust, anti-colonial movement is really getting ramped up. You have a lot of Americans and a lot of Black GIs in France. So I'm rambling a little bit. I can tend to do that. I'll cut myself off here. But that's at heart the story that the New Internationals engages with.
Great, terrific. Thank you very much. So I'm thinking about the character of Cecile Rosenbaum, again, inspired by your mother's story. You speak about how she needs to, and here I'm quoting again from the novel, and maybe at a couple points you'll be willing to read a section from the novel for our audience, that she chased after others' stories. And she's fascinated with first Zeb, who, as you say, is the son and rather the son of and the grandson of a king involved in the slave trade, as well as then a black GI whose story engages her as well in a deep way, as it turns out. But in light of the Museum of Jewish Heritage as our virtual meeting this evening, as our setting, could you address the matter of Cecile's Jewish identity? What has shaped Cecile, and perhaps if you'd like to speak more personally about your mother, I know you just mentioned a bit about her. What has shaped her deepest self? In the novel, you write, quote, Cecile had bought a necklace, a Star of David pendant, in the first weeks after liberation, and worn it since visibly, insistently, on the outside of garments. Why does Cecile need to display her Jewishness after the war? What need in her does such visibility fulfill? Cecile, again, you write about her, wears the star, quote, expressly to shock. And when you can develop that for us, it give us an even deeper sense of the relation between Cecile and the matter of Jewishness.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book opens just the very first chapter, and then it skips forward to 1947. But the book opens when we're introduced to Cecile in her youth before the war, and she is the child of a very wealthy but very secular Jewish family. And that hews with my mom's own background. Cecile's a little bit older than my mom was, but she, is raised in this very wealthy family. Her mother and her father are part of, this larger family. Everybody congregates on Sundays at the mansion of the grandparents. And amongst her cousins, the children, Cecile is doted upon by her grandmother. They're art dealers, they're, antiquarians, they have beautiful art, they have, Picassos and things like that. And sort of very young age, Cecile is introduced to herself as French. She understands herself as French. I think she knows herself as to be a Jew, but because there's such a secular Jewish family, for her, it's another descriptor like, having auburn hair or brown eyes. It doesn't translate itself into specific practices or worships or worship or anything like that. So she's a child of privilege, of entitlement in suburban Paris, is introduced to art, is really drawn to art like her grandmother's, and she's rewarded for it. She understands caste in a way. The servants in the household, the girls, what they would call girls are young women, but who work in the kitchen and who clean are local French girls, not Jewish. But Cecile, they dote on her too. The war happens. And once the war happens, her Jewishness is imposed upon her. Because her father, who's active in a peripheral way, but in an important way with the resistance, he has connections and knows people. He's able to doctor papers so that the immediate family, he and his child and his wife, are sheltered to a certain extent. They're hiding in plain sight. It's not that they're not Jewish, but their Jewishness is sort of legally lesser. It doesn't save his mother and father. They're deported, they die. So Cecile at an age, she's 14 when the war breaks out, right when she's coming to understand herself, I think the way that we all do at a relatively young age, when you're 13, 14, you're asking yourself questions like, who might I be in the world? Am I attractive? Typical teenage questions. When she begins to ask those questions, she, at that moment, is when her Jewishness is imposed upon her, but in a way that is so fraught, right? They're hiding in plain sight. Her parents enroll her in a Catholic school. She does First Holy Communion. She understands that she can't sort of embrace Jewishness even as she wants to push back against these oppressive forces. So that turmoil sort of is working inside of her. She, the neighbors are deported. She befriends the boy who's about her age and manages to escape. They have a romance, and she's imagining herself in that way. She's understanding herself as a young woman in that way, but he's suffered a terrible tragedy, having lost his parents. So he's a little bit rough with her, you know. She comes out of the war very confused, wanting to embrace her Jewishness, but not knowing how. So the Star of David, they did not have to wear during the war, even as her family and some friends had to. She wants to assert that. She also feels conflicted about her Frenchness, right? It's French people who came and arrested the neighbors. It's French people who, you know, mocked Jews. In a scene at the end of that first chapter, she witnesses the lynching, for lack of a better word, of
Right.
some collaborationists. You know, she feels anger towards them too, but she also, you know, identifies to a certain extent with the young woman that she's sees who gets her head shaved. So she finds herself not wanting to be any of that, right? She wants to be seen as Jewish, but she doesn't know what that means. She's rejecting her Frenchness. So she embraces the Communist Party. That feels like maybe an avenue towards freedom. And it's in that context that she starts meeting people from the anti-colonial movement. And that's where she's really drawn in, people that she feels like their otherness is visible, plain, and they have a similar outlook, and they have a similar desire for freedom. So in trying to understand herself as a French Jew, she embraces other marginalized French people.
Wow. So she's tangled up in all these identities that compel her, but also she needs to resist them as well. But her deepest self is as a dreamer, as you say, as someone who longs for some new way to be, a utopian way to be. My quote again later on in the novel, not mongrel, which is a pejorative term for her, but rather beautiful and new.
Yeah.
There's something about Cecile that though there's that need or itch to shove the Jew star pendant in people's faces, there's something that beyond that has a utopian aspect to her way of being in the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You describe her as a dreamer, and that's exactly what she is. She recognizes herself as having been fortunate to have survived with what she and her immediate family survived. But she also comes out of the war going, this can't be what the world is. She's rejecting what she's known and what's been imposed upon her, and she's looking for a way. She's imagining that people like her, young people like her, can make a better world. The old world betrayed them, betrayed her immediate family. Her grandmother is dead. You know, they've lost all their wealth. You know, she doesn't know she's a woman, and that's important too. She recognizes as a woman during the war, Joelle, this young Jewish neighbor, had made her understand her vulnerability as a young woman. And so she just rejects anybody imposing upon her their understanding of her. And she's imagining that if she can be with other people like her, dreamers like her, but I think we're describing her as a dreamer. I think she would define herself as like a visionary, as a realist, like this is what we can make the world become. And that's what she, you know, sort of headlong thrusts herself into.
So what attracts her to at first to Zeb? I know he's, as you suggest, he's a dreamer as well, but also a very complicated young man with all kinds of generational pressures to succeed in, I guess, a post-colonial setting in Paris after the war. Lots of generational burdens upon him. But what makes Zeb for Cecile so attractive? And if I could ask the obviously complimentary question, what attracts Zeb to Cecile?
So just a little background. So again, Zeb being based on my biological father, the descendant of the kings of Dahomey. And this was true of my father's story. But Zeb arrives in France with an older sister before the war. So Dahomey is a colony. His father, their father, is of a certain caste position, but he's a colonial subject. And so he's an activist against sort of French colonialism. Again, before the war, this is true after the war, but before the war. So when his older sister Jacqueline and he are sent to France to get an education so that after having been educated, they would, prove to French people, to France, to French society, that Africans can accomplish anything that a French person can. They're given this burden, task, duty, but burden at a really young age. I forget the age I give them in the book, but it's roughly Cecile's age, 12, 13, 14, therein. They arrive in France. They're colonial subjects. They're fairly isolated. They're first with an uncle, but he's treating them a little bit like servants too. So they break away, and they're surrounded mostly by French people. I mean, I think France now, when I think of France as like New York, this place that has all these folks from all these different places, all these different cultures, and it's visible. Paris in the 1930s, that's not that, right? There are very few Africans around, and they're really young. Then the war happens. So it creates an absolute separation. Zeb understands his duty to his lineage, to represent his lineage with pride, to be enrolled in school and succeed, achieve. The war is an absolute separation. And they managed to survive it, much thanks to his older sister. His sister's only a few years older, but she is brilliant. She's assertive. She's able to begin to establish herself. He has to flee to the south of France, and because she's with nuns who take her in, he has to flee to the south of France, where she continues getting an education. He's trained as a carpenter, So he's in a different position. He's separated from his family, also from his sister. He understands his duty, but he doesn't know how to accomplish it. The war ends. He still has the duty. He and his sister are reunited. He still has this duty, but he hasn't even finished high school, right? So I think he feels particularly vulnerable. But he also, if he arrived in France when he was 9 or 10, at 20, he spent at least as much of his life, and the really formative part of his life, mostly surrounded by white French people. And so while he, experiences racism, he also like his friends are also white people, French people. And so in Cecile, I think that rebelliousness and her as another person who has been othered and made to be an outsider, but also has this insider piece, they connect in that way. And she also, so she's attracted to, he has, just as a character, as a person in the world, he has a certain poise, a certain maturity from what he's experienced. And he has this drive to do well. That's attractive to her. And with her, he's attracted to her energy, to her Frenchness on some level. She's the French woman that, that he's maybe been attracted to, but never has had an opportunity to have contact with during the war and all that. So they're young, they're 19, 20, and they're just drawn to each other and fall in love, and they complement each other in interesting ways. But, and this is for me, in my own thinking about it, the thing that I thought was interesting, where they're both insider outsiders, for him, he's not Cecile has got that rebelliousness where she, it's like she is, sticking her anger in people's faces. Seb has an anger too, but it's to reclaim a tradition. He's not rejecting a tradition. He wants to be able to reclaim a tradition that is marginalized. And so they're drawn to each other, but they also have this little, the beginning of a small crack that might grow bigger.
To give our reader, to give our watchers, our listeners, a sense of the power of your prose as well as this core complex relationship, would you read just some sections at the bottom of page 94, and then if you can skip around, I'll let you figure out where to skip. So the bottom of 94, Cecile admired his grace. And then that sort of middle paragraph on 96, Cecile wondered if this was all as well as the paragraph or so after that, just to give our readers and would-be readers, and I hope there'll be lots of readers for the New Internationals, a sense of your voice, and above all, a sense of these rich young people in their a moment of transition, of encounter, and of a need to discover what you call in this passage, as you'll see, a new story. Each, maybe you can end at that moment here, I'm just quoting you, each one needed a new story. And that seems for me absolutely key to the New Internationals. You're telling or retelling a story that's, I'm not sure haunted is the right word, but certainly has tangled you up, and you want to untangle it, so to speak, in the novel. But both Seb and Cecile also have tangled stories, and they need to untangle them for themselves, but obviously with each other as the source or agent of the untangling. And so Cecile admired his grace. If you would read inter alia the next page and a half or so, and you can choose where to maybe stop and then start again.
Yeah, I would love to. So just to set the scene slightly, they've met in this communist youth convention camp in the south of France, and they arrive back in Paris. And Cecile has gotten a job at the Louvre, which she's really drawn to. She maybe aspires to be an artist. And Seb is preparing for the competitive entrance exam to l'École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts, where, Louis Sullivan, like, Monet, like great artists have gone, and he wants to be on the architecture track. But again, he doesn't have a high school degree. So he has this pressure, and Cecile is going to help him study. She's, finished high school during the war. And so after work at the Louvre, she goes in and meets him. So they will study together. And she's thinking about him in this moment. Cecile admired his grace, his keen intelligence, but more than this, she adored him. Lying in his bed in the dark, nestled in the crook of his arm, her body become one with his, was a feeling of home unlike any she'd known. She felt safe, serene, yet energized too, inspired, like Sundays chez Mamie Lucie, her grandmother. And she knew that he felt strongly for her too. His attentiveness, a reassuring hand on the small of her back, the way she caught him gazing at her when she would glance up and he'd not expected her to. This mattered. No need for self-flagellation to demonstrate herself worthy of affection, no begging for approval. This was nothing like being with Joël. Still, despite this growing feeling, things sometimes took a strange turn, unpredictably, and she couldn't pinpoint the reason why. It was like an invisible door would push up between them at random moments, and she didn't have the key to unlock it. The distance between them, though short for sure, seemed impassable, and it had something to do with the words. And then she starts thinking about her own past. Did you want me to continue or skip forward
in the next paragraph, Zeb wove the words into stories.
Yeah. So she's okay. I'll keep going forward. Cecile thought about the strange muddle of sounds to which he'd introduced her. And then there are some African words, and she's begun to understand. Nadaho, elder sister. Nyeklohento, razor woman. And the names of his forefathers. Agaja, Gizo, Béanzin. Béanzin, the last king of Dahomey, who had refused to bow to France and had driven back the colonial soldiers bent on his submission. He had to be banished to Martinique to forestall the uprisings that were certain to arise should he be allowed to stay in Africa. This was Seb's father's father. Seb wove the words into stories that were colorful and larger than life, his thick voice animated and resonant. But the grandeur he breathed into the words didn't match the underlying truth of those very stories. It was as though he didn't recognize that he spoke of betrayal and horror and masses of captives shackled neck to neck and herded to the coast to be sold. It was as though he didn't see that, whether only a pretext for the colonial conquest or not. The French had been determined to abolish the slave trade, and wasn't there something right and good in that? The contradiction rattled Cecile. She didn't know how to point them out without seeming to imply a savagery in him that his intelligence and demeanor in every way refuted.
Mhm. Wow. Wow.
Thank you. Yeah.
The passage that another half a page down or on the next page also moved me deeply. If you don't mind my voicing it through you, maybe Cecile chased after others' stories, their grain and color and detail, to replenish the desert spaces in her own story, to substitute for the things she would rather forget. And then one more sentence, if you'll indulge me. I'm so moved by it, David. This shared sense of absence would explain why their lives were so easily braiding together, despite their differences, because each one needed more than just his own words, because each one needed a new story. Did Zeb recognize it too? Wow.
Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's not what might be called her Jewish identity, perhaps, that moves her towards Zeb, or is it? Which is to say, since this is a deep, and for me, as you can tell, key sequence in the novel, is there, in your mind, in your imagination, a connection between Cecile's impudent display, if that's the right word, or purposeful display of her Jewishness independent, but it seems to be her identity more deeply served, more deeply not just attracted, but fulfilled, deepened, thickened by Zeb, or through Zeb. She needed a new story, and I take it not the new story to be, say, to practice Judaism in any way that one might after the war, but what is there about Zeb? And we need to talk about Mac Gray as well, if we have time, her other love interest, to say the least. What is the story, the new story that Zeb offers, provides Cecile, that she senses, yet at the same time, without giving too much away, it doesn't work?
Right. Right. I think, again, understanding herself to be a Jew, to be Jewish, but not knowing what that means, in just traditional ways, not having been introduced to it, and then having been separated it from the war. I think Seb's love of his own traditions and cultures, which he shares with her in previous scenes when they're together. He has some artifacts that they had brought from home, a Dahomey tapestry, if you've ever seen them, and he pulls it out and shows it with pride, even though he can only half explain it. So he tells her these stories, but in the stories he tells, also what she sees with him in relation to his sister, his older sister, who again is a sort of more than a matriarch. She's almost the patriarch of them, their family unit there in France. She recognizes that he reveres women too. Like he respects, like he is subservient to his older sister, even though he's the boy and has the place, you know. And so the fact that he has tradition, that he can speak to her, right, through these words that she doesn't fully understand, but that he clearly is trying to draw out a story. And that in those stories that he tells stories of warrior queens, right? If any of y'all, if you, Donald, or if any of y'all in the audience saw the movie the Woman King, that came out a couple of years ago, that was about my family heritage, and it was about these, the role. I mean, it was about a lot of things, and it was a Hollywood movie, but at heart were these women warriors who were leading this African kingdom, this important African kingdom. So all that is appealing to her. The thing that he doesn't quite see, and that she increasingly feels, is in that world that he's describing, she would be one of the people who was maybe taken away. right? As a Jew during the war, she was more akin to the slaves who were marched to the coast by his ancestors. And so, again, that's that little bit of a crack that's beginning to show itself, even as she's so drawn to him and him to her. Their stories maybe are destined to clash a little bit. The story they're trying to create together is maybe a better way to put it.
It's a real tragedy,
Mm.
emotional tragedy. So
Yeah.
there's another key figure that you alluded to in the novel, the Black GI, who's charismatic and warm and kind of what he's a kind of sharpie kind of guy, I guess. Mac, what's the Cecile Mac story briefly, and why does that somehow work out if that's not giving too much away?
Yeah.
And Zeb, perhaps. Well, I won't say much more than that.
Yeah, we don't want to ruin the end, but that's the love triangle. Who will she choose? And Mac Gray, the Black GI, is similar in that, again, he's in Paris, the history of Paris. There's a great book by Tyler Stovall called Paris Noir. And it's a nonfiction book, but it's all about, African Americans in Paris in the 20th century, so many of them who were artists and who chose to live there, Josephine Baker in that style. That's not exactly Mac. I mean, Mac is a GI and he's there because of the army. But once he's there, he's drawn to that. He gets involved in the music scene, in his spare time. He's also involved in the black market scene. All the privilege that he not only does not have at home, but he's in an opposite position, being a Black American in Jim Crow America. In France, French people are drawn to him. He also is an American soldier. He's got American dollars in a time when the economy is in shambles. So he recognizes that too. When he meets Cecile, they're drawn to each other in a different way. Whereas Seb has this sort of, dignity. It's not that Mac lacks it, but Seb has this sort of like quiet dignity. He wants to get into the School of Fine Arts and be an architect. Mac is big and boisterous and fun. He plays in a jazz band. He invites her to do things. He has money, so he buys her gifts. He can shower her with gifts. And so that's appealing to Cecile. And in this interesting way, he, as the descendant of slaves, he as a Black American in Jim Crow America, is closer to her as a Jew in France. He's been othered more similarly to how she has, right? He and his community has been the victim of legalized violence, right? And she recognizes that, and he comes to recognize that in her. With Mac, though, he's a little bit complicated in that he understands that having a white woman on his arm that's like Cecile's Star of David pendant. That's saying to society, screw you. And he boasts, I'm going to bring a white woman back. And it's not necessarily Cecile, it's just in the abstract. But then he meets Cecile, and she's got that thing that is appealing. Beyond the fact that she's a white woman, they have this connection that they strike.
Wow. So the story that Mac offers, so to speak, that fulfills Cecile, if you will, and the story that she offers him as well, connects her and this now gets a bit more personal, I know as well, to a potential, again, if not utopian world, but at least a world where a white Jewish woman can marry a Black American GI, move to America, and perhaps produce, not perhaps, and a parent for a time, a young writer.
Yeah. My mom, she loved books. She loved books. We just grew up in it. Didn't matter if we were, at times we lived like, in Section 8 housing and food stamps, but there was always bookshelves of books, and she would just read and read and read. My big sister too. I was never a reader. I came to reading and literature and all that later. I was just sort of a dunderhead. I played football coming up. I'd go run around.
Mm-hmm.
But I always understood to respect and admire books and authors. And so, when I finished college and, was confused in my own ways and not knowing what to do, writing seemed like an honorable thing to try to do, if nothing else in honor of my mother.
And you had a lot of stories to untangle.
I definitely had a lot of stories to untangle.
I have one more sort of, I think it's a large question. Um, and it comes from that excellent New Yorker essay about the truth about my father, which is again, a donnée of the New Internationals. And I encourage everybody out there to read both the New Yorker piece from 2022, you can easily find it, and of course, your new novel. There's a great scene in the memoir in the New Yorker where your biological grandfather, that is Zeb's father, if we want to make that kind of genealogical connection, says, quote, "The child has returned home."
Yeah.
And I think he's referring to you.
Yes.
Moment, his grandson. That is, this is a cosmic statement uttered by your biological grandfather. In the matter of homeland, where to be, how to be, seems also as a key theme running through the New Internationals. So I guess my perhaps last, or it was one of my last larger question is, so what or where is home for you? And you might want to first address it to the characters in the novel, or not. Of course, it's up to you. But to return seems like a key idea. Without giving too many spoilers away, that young man who we meet at the beginning of the novel, Joel, he returns, so to speak, or to use the phrase, makes aliyah, and becomes self-named Kiba. Meaning he becomes an Israeli and he leaves France post-war, leaves Vichy and that horrible world, and returns, I suppose if that's the right word, home.
Yeah.
The child has returned home.
Yeah.
That again seemed like a cosmic statement, a crucial statement. How would you respond, or just reflect rather, on the meaning of home for you, but maybe for the characters of the novel, but maybe for you as well, since your novel takes you, and your own journeys have taken you from the States, from in Texas and elsewhere, to France, to West Africa, but also in your imagination to places that you didn't know about or couldn't have known about, but now recuperate brilliantly in the New Internationals. So where or what do you understand to be home?
It's a great question, and a hard one, but a great question. And just for the audience, on my author website, it's David Wright Books. It's not David Wright Faladay, but just David Wright Books. I have the essay from the New Yorker from that summer of 22. If you can just click on the link and it'll open. And it is about notions of home. And in my own story, again, I call myself a Texan, in part because that's where I grew up, probably the bigger chunk of my youth. Actively left Texas after high school and was in Minnesota and moving around. And then I discover or uncover a little bit of both, get to know my French family, and then eventually my African family. And all those places feel home-ish. And I'm saying that as a way to say, I put this in the words, these words in the mouth of Matt Gray. And I think that Cecile feels this also. She's seeking a home, and it's not the home that was taken from her that just doesn't exist anymore. She's seeking a home in a similar way that Matt Gray is, and they're dislocated. With Seb, it's a little bit more like his home is Dahomey. But Cecile and Mac, and it's Mac who articulates it at one point, and I totally pirated this. The woman I was seeing when I graduated college, and all this was beginning to happen, where I was gonna get to know my African family. We were talking, and I remember she articulated it, and I totally stole her words, but she said, "Home extends to the boundaries of my body." So wherever I end up being, whether it's with my French family, or whether it's like I'm in Austin, Texas now, if it's here in a, place that is Texas, or if I'm in Dahomey with my, in Benin with my Dahomeyan family, my biological family, I always feel at home, because home is the connections I'm making with people, right? And those people are connecting with me, whether it's my French family in France, whether it's my big sister, my little sister here, whether it's those West African folks that I got to know as an adult, but that completely embraced me. And one last little bit that's slightly digressive, but that you evoked, it actually came up, Danny Shapiro's podcast, Family Secrets. She's such a, she just asked really interesting questions, much like you're doing. She called that episode, it was from last November, she called it The Two Names, and it was in regards to the New Yorker piece as much as anything. But that the child coming home, my biological grandfather was also an insider-outsider, having been raised by Catholic missionaries, but being the descendant of kings, and then he was, the king's tribal ethnicity were Fon, F-O-N. And he was, to protect him after his father was exiled, he was raised by a Yoruba man. And so he always sort of caught between the two. And so when he embraced me, he gave me two names. And the Yoruba name is, the child is returning, the tiara has returned to the house. The child has returned home. But he also gave me a Fon name, and it's Héros au nom, which means compagnon de route, traveling companion. And he told me, he said, I sent my son off to France to get an education, and he came back with a traveling companion. So I always thought that was funny.
Great.
But yeah.
But thank you thank you. I think we should turn to questions that have been inspired, I hope, by our conversation, and for people who've read the book. So maybe I should turn to Isabel, and she can take over.
Amazing. Well, thank you both for such an incredible discussion. It has certainly inspired some great audience questions, which we love to see. Just a reminder to our audience, if you have a question and haven't submitted it yet, please do so. And also apologies in advance if we don't get to everyone's question. I will also try to combine some questions that are slightly similar, just so as many people as possible can get their questions answered. We'll start with one sort of about the process of writing this book. David, some people have asked, since this story has such a personal nature for you, if the process for writing this book differed at all from your other writing that you've done in the past.
It's a great question, and absolutely,
Mhm.
for a lot of reasons. But I mean, I worked, the New Internationals came out in January. I worked on it for 17 years, almost 20.
Wow.
And I thought I'd finished twice before, fairly early on. And that was, with a little distance, that was clearly not finished. But in 2014, I'd finished a draft that was about 500 pages long. It was just a big,
Wow.
I hope I'm not scaring anybody off. The New Internationals is about 300. But that earlier draft was about 500 pages, and it encompassed so much more of the history and of the stories. Same fundamental story, a love triangle. But I landed an agent, a very strong, reputable agent, who described back to me exactly what I thought I'd written. And she circulated it to the publishing houses, and they all came back with a criticism, not its length, although that was part of it, I came to understand. But it was the character of Cecile, based on my mother. I had landed the Zeb character, I had landed the Mac character, but Cecile wasn't quite right. And I was thinking, so this was 2014, 2015, I was thinking about giving up. And I had the great good fortune of being a Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library. And when I was there, at that point, I was thinking I wasn't going to write Cecile out, but I was going to remove her as a point of view character. I thought if Mac and Seb are working, they can just tell the story, and she's sort of the object of desire, and she's maybe a little just out of reach, out of grasp. But a fellow, Maddie Tien, Edelyn Chen, who's this wonderful writer, has a novel coming out in May. Everybody was like, don't get rid of Cecile. But she was like, what if you wrote your mother as nonfiction? That was where the New Yorker piece came from. I was like, and it was in that exercise of writing her as nonfiction that allowed me to understand her and also to distinguish her from Cecile. But in so doing, I also understood that it needed to fold in and drive forward a little bit better. That's a long-winded answer. That's a little probably off the question, but fundamentally for me, the process was so different. But it was different in part because I think the story is so big and does this. And a novel, the sorts of novels that, there are big novels that do this, but the sorts of novels that draw me, Black Cloud Rising, do this, and they drive forward. And I learned that actually through writing Black Cloud Rising that came before. My first two books are a little bit bigger like that. That one, it drives forward. I hope I answered the question. I feel like I spoke all over the place.
No, definitely. And I'm so glad somebody asked that question because what an incredible answer. Um, we have kind of a related question about, writing the story and your mother. Someone is asking, this isn't purely a nonfiction book, it's historical fiction. Um, they're asking what kind of inspired you in that choice to write a historical fiction novel instead of doing something that was pure nonfiction, like a memoir or biography or that type of work.
Yeah. Well, so when I first come to the story, my mother, she was the sort of person who was like, ask me anything, I'll tell you whatever. But at the same time, when I was getting older and beginning to, ask the questions, she seemed to not have, it wasn't an evasion as much as it felt like a block. Like she couldn't tell me much. I had another great good fortune in my 20s after college. I lived in France and my grandmother was still alive, her mother. So even as I'm beginning to get to know my African family, I'm with my grandmother, and she was born in 1907. Like she was like in her early 80s when I'm in France. She lived on the fourth floor of one of those great French buildings, but without an elevator. And so I would have lunch with her every Friday. And, we'd go and do shopping. We'd meet downstairs and we'd shop. And then she would do all her heavy shopping for the week, and I would carry it upstairs, and she'd make me lunch. We'd have lunch, and she would tell me stories. So I'm saying that as a way to say I began to piece together the story in this way that was like letters, anecdotes, things like that. And I didn't have a grasp of the history. And so when I began it as a novel, it began as a short story, actually, it's because I felt like I would have to invent more. But in part because it took me 17 years to do, the history began to present itself. I mean, other family doing more formal interviews, more time spent in archives. And so I had the stories, but then I also had the history. And because those three characters, those three people were so firmly in the middle of important history, at a certain point, I felt an obligation to the history. But the next part of the answer is, the book I'm working on now is actually that. It's their stories as nonfiction. Their stories, I think, are so important. The New Internationals is their characters based upon them collapsed into 8 months. But their stories spans the civil rights movement, goes all the way back to the slave trade, moves forward sort of past the civil rights movement, obviously is about the Holocaust. So it feels like that New Yorker piece made me realize it merits being told as nonfiction. And I have the sort of, I'm sitting right in the middle of it, the research to do it. Just one last little bit, because I'm rambling, but my grandmother, she was a graphologist, which she was just awesome. A character based on her in the New International, but she was a graphologist. And when she would tell me stories about my mother, she'd sometimes go back into her room and come out with a letter and describe it in the handwriting. And at one point, we got to be very close. At one point, she was like, "Do you want the letters?" And she gave me she had kept every letter that my mom had sent her from the 40s when she was a child to the mid 80s. So I have like these 300 letters that are I just have this great archive that I hope to, be able to bring to life in the new book.
Wow, great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. And you also answered a question about what was next for this story. So really, it's like you're reading my mind with these. And I know our audience is probably as excited as I am about these nonfiction stories continuing.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. We have, I think, time for a couple more questions. So I'll just pick out a few. Someone is asking a little bit more of a literary question. They're saying, even though this book is inspired by history and also your family's story, they're wondering if there are any specific books or authors that also had an impact on you or influenced you when you were writing this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I love Toni Morrison and, you know, all the usual suspects, especially those early books. And when I lived in France, I was beginning to try to be a writer. I was reading and rereading Toni Morrison. But I remember Tar Baby, one of her, I think, a great novel, but overlooked. And it's one of the ones that's unusual. One of the things that I try to get at with all my work, Black Cloud Rising is trying to do this too, but get at that notion of mixedness. I find modern identity and specifically modern American identity being this mixing, this where cultures come together. It's not always clean, it's sometimes in conflict, but fundamentally cultures are coming together. And in Tar Baby, that's one of her first novels where you have these significant white characters. And I'm bringing it up in part because Toni Morrison is an influence in all her work.
Mm-hmm.
But in that, one, she has one of her characters say, and it was the epigraph to the book forever, and then I eventually took it out. But one of her characters says, there are no mixed races. You don't mix races. You abandon them or pick them. And I thought that describes kind of the complexity at the heart of these three characters. So as a literary influence, yes. And also the way that she was challenging, you know, sort of notions of identity and of racial identity and all that. And I have to say, with my own The New Internationals, I'm pushing against that notion.
Mm-hmm.
Not saying that was Toni Morrison, it was coming from a character, but it struck me so much that I wanted to write a story that's pushing against that. The other influence, and in more thematic way, than the actual words on the page and trying to, you know, attain a certain lyricism or whatever. But James Baldwin, I left the country just admiring James Baldwin and reading a ton of James Baldwin. And it was my absolute utter dream to get to France and get on a train and go to the south of France and meet him. And I started in England and I'm beginning to write. And then in December 87, I had this opportunity to meet my grandfather, and I had to go through Paris to get the ticket from family members. And I'm like, when I get back from Africa, I'm gonna meet James Baldwin. And I get up the next day and I open up Le Monde and he died. He died the week that I got to France, so I never got to meet him. But he is just an influence. His great big mind and his great big heart.
Amazing. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So apologies to everyone whose questions we didn't get to. I think this one seems like kind of a nice question to end on. And also, Donald, if you have any input on this question, I think it's kind of opens it up to you as well. Some people are wondering, you know, what, David, you hope a reader today might take from this story, both, you know, the historical fiction book and also your family's story, and also, Donald, what you who have studied this book so closely, what you personally have got from this novel.
If I
Well,
start,
David?
I start just because I want to start by thanking you, Donald. Just again, your engagement with my novel. I guess I won't speak for other novelists, but for me, it's like a dream. Like reading the review of the book, and then this conversation that we've had, and the questions. I learned a lot about my book just by our conversation. So I want to thank you. Yeah, and maybe pass it off to you.
Well, there's a couple quotes from David that would be my epigraphs for a fuller essay reading of the new internationals, and perhaps of David's work in general. One is from the novel about the metaphor of mixedness and above all braidedness. How to untangle the twist of mystery that was his father. This tangling and untangling, the twist of mystery. It's an astonishing phrase. And it seems to me that in the New International, David Faraday is heroically, brilliantly trying to untangle the twist of mystery that has shaped him and continues to shape him, and obviously now we discover continues to write about at this moment. But to untangle the twist of mystery is a very challenging but also a noble enterprise, and we're all in your debt. The other epigraph would be, the other phrase as an epigraph would be also from the novel, quote, nothing was static. If I had to, write something on my wall, on a poster or whatever, I would use that. Nothing was static. Everything is in movement. Everything is in transition. Selves, history, love. We're always somehow moving. And it seems to me the New Internationals, if you had to have an epigraph for it, for me anyway, that would be it as well. Nothing was static.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for that great answer, and also such a beautiful quote. I think it's really a powerful quote to end on. We're very prompt tonight. It's 8:02. So congratulations to all of us for timing that so well. Donald and David, I want to thank you again just for such an incredible program tonight. Of course, thank you to our audience for joining us.